In this video, I will have to talk about some very controversial people. What I said in the Twitter episode still applies here. Doubly so. I want to remind people that just because I talk about or even object to how people are treated does not mean that I endorse their opinions or actions. One comment that frequently appeared on my Twitter segment was that freedom of speech does not mean freedom of consequence. That is true, but every action or word does not deserve every single consequence. Just as I can believe that the death penalty is wrong and murderers should be punished, I can believe that the opinions and actions held by the people in this video are wrong, but their treatment was the incorrect course of action. In the past few years, YouTube has made it more and more difficult to make a living for a wide variety of people. A large swath of them have been deemed not advertiser-friendly. Some of the people delisted were genuinely offensive and awful people taking advantage of YouTube's systems to be hateful, or commit copyright infringement. However, along the way, several other types of people have been affected. Some of them were independent news creators that got demonetized whenever they talked about a touchy subject. Some of them were comedians who told less politically correct material. And some of them were social commentators that had unpopular opinions. One saving grace for many of these people that appeared to bubble up beneath the surface was the website Patreon. Patreon is a crowdfunding service that was specifically made to help with these fears. Previous crowdfunding sites like Indiegogo or Kickstarter or GoFundMe forced their users to have some kind of end goal, a product that they wanted to make, for instance. Patreon was designed to be more ongoing. With Patreon donations, there was no end goal. Users could determine if people would donate after every project, or after every month, and there are pros and cons to both settings. In the years since Patreon was founded in 2013, it became a reprieve for YouTubers and other internet content creators that had concerns over free speech. It attracted a wide variety of people, from the far left to the far right. People of all types had created Patreon accounts, and the site seemed to be largely neutral when it came to the online politicking that you'd see on sites like Facebook or Twitter. This reputation changed in July of 2017. The first high-profile banning of a Patreon account was that of Lauren Southern of Rebel Media. Rebel Media is a far-right conservative news platform, but that's not what got their account banned. Lauren's account and several others were banned for interrupting a search and rescue ship in the Mediterranean during the migrant crisis. According to Jack Conte, the CEO of Patreon, this counted as something that he dubbed as Manifest Observable Behavior, or MOB.
Everything to do with a concept called manifest observable behavior. The purpose of using manifest observable behavior is to remove personal values and beliefs when the team is reviewing content. It's a review method that's entirely based on observable facts. What has a camera seen? What has an audio device recorded? It doesn't matter what your intentions are, your motivations, who you are, your identity, your ideology. The trust and safety team only looks at manifest observable behavior. We get rigorous and specific because we're talking about removing a person's income. The authority to take away a human being's income is a sobering responsibility. In
this video, Jack goes on to describe what methods and standards that he and the company Patreon has when it comes to removing people from the platform. Lauren was removed because, according to Jack Conte, she was taking action or threatening to take action that could lead to harm. Jack Conte defines manifest observable behavior as actions that a camera can see and hear. He goes on describing this as it not mattering why you're doing this particular action.
You can't use manifest observable behavior to say who someone is. That's just a more nebulous claim. You can use manifest observable behavior to say what someone did or didn't do, and whether or not those things are or are not against your content policy.
Jack Conte also notes that there is a distinction between credible threats and non-credible threats. Lauren Southern's actions were deemed as credible harm to others. Some people liked the standard, and some people hated the standard and critiqued Patreon harshly for this. But either way, Patreon had set forth a standard on who they would remove from their platform. Personally speaking, I am not against Patreon being able to ban people that they consider dangerous or destructive. However, when you do make a standard like this, you do open yourself up to scrutiny. As we've established with Tumblr, it can be impossible to hold such rigorous standards for everyone. There are several Antifa groups that have Patreon pages. If you don't know, this group has been responsible for many domestic terror attacks, and both the FBI and Homeland Security have warned as such. For what it's worth, I do respect Patreon's standard. Patreon should not help in funding what could amount to real-world crimes and the actual danger of individuals. Actions that cause damage to people or violate the law should not be supported through a platform like Patreon. If people do slip through the cracks, well, that's only the reality of the internet. Let's call out these people as we find them. However, let's move away from talking about actions and talk more about the words that have gotten people banned from Patreon. Carl Benjamin is a YouTuber, better known as Sargon of Akkad, who is known for critiquing social justice and other concepts usually held by the left and the far left, and he has been a very controversial person. He had been on Patreon for 4 years when he was banned without warning. What had happened is that activists had located a podcast. In this podcast, Sargon was debating members of the alt-right, and he used the N-word against them several times. There are a few issues with this entire scenario. The first is that this podcast was not a part of Sargon's Patreon persona. The podcast was not his. It was not uploaded to his YouTube channel. It is also not real-world manifest observable behavior. As far as I could tell, the N-word, even said by a person who isn't black, is not against the rules of Patreon, as there have been many other people who have used that particular word in a wide variety of circumstances. Patreon later claimed that Sargon had done so many collaborations and debates that these had become a part of his Patreon persona. However, that criteria is very vague, nebulous, and incredibly subject to change. There are many people who are still on Patreon that use their platforms specifically to debate other people, and these are people who may be considered very controversial. It is also not up to Patreon as to what determines someone's Patreon persona, as any individual can choose whether or not to alert their patrons of each work or collaboration that they've done, even if they choose to be funded every single month instead of after every single work. To most outside observers, this appeared like a very selective enforcing of the rules. Sargon was banned for something that he did not do or support with Patreon as a platform, no matter what way you cut it. Even if you hate Sargon and you hate what he did, you do have to ask yourself if you want this standard to apply. That no matter what you do, anywhere else, you have the ability to get removed from Patreon, which is a substantial portion of many people's income. Remember, it doesn't have to be Jack Conte in charge. It could be anyone with any morals that they choose. This happened after Jack Conte stated on the Dave Rubin podcast that such a thing would not happen. He stated that what you do on Patreon is what you get banned for on Patreon. And when we talk about payment processors like Patreon, we have to keep in mind, this isn't the same thing as getting a Twitter account blocked. Patreon is income. Income is what people need to survive. And banning someone's Patreon account can very much lead them into destitution. In Patreon's terms of service, they do state that they can ban you for harming Patreon as a brand. This means that simply critiquing them like this video does means that my Patreon account is at risk. Technically speaking, sharing this video puts Patreon accounts at risk. There's a reason that nobody reads EULAs. Their language is so vague and nebulous that they mean literally anything, that there is no point to reading them. The podcast that Sargon was banned for, it happened 10 months before he was removed from the platform. And it wasn't like Sargon was not a controversial person before this banning, or before this incident, or even before he signed up to Patreon 4 years prior. Sargon's very persona is attacking concepts of political correctness. Nothing about Sargon's presence on Patreon had changed before or after this incident. And applying something that somebody had done 10 months ago on a whim is by any standard a miscarriage of justice. If it was truly that egregious what he had done, why was he not banned more immediately? Yes, Patreon is a private company and they can ban whoever they wish. After all, freedom of speech does not mean freedom from consequences. However, censorship also has consequences, and sometimes they could be far, far worse than allowing a controversial person on your platform. Removing Sargon from Patreon has had wide-reaching costs that has not just affected Patreon as a company, but it has affected many of the people who rely on Patreon for an income. Many people across the board found their Patreon income severely down, and this is for a variety of reasons. Firstly, many people quit right out of protest. These weren't just random people either. High-profile people left the platform with Patreon accounts totaling in the tens of thousands of dollars per month. This included Sam Harris, a person who was one of the top 10 biggest Patreon accounts at the time. A lot of Patreon supporters also had vanished when this happened. Many of the people were there primarily to support people like Sargon or Sam Harris, and just gave to other creators with their extras. When their primary reason for staying on the platform vanished, so did these people. These people tended to be the $1 or $2 donators, which make up the lifeblood of most people's Patreons. This one banning affected so many people who had never heard of Sargon, and didn't care about him at all. And that's just how the story begins. In the month afterward, Patreon was not able to pay their users for a few days. Patreon has also gone on record stating that its business model is not sustainable as it sees rapid growth, even though it appears that rapid growth is not currently happening. Both of these instances are very confusing to me. Logically, what Patreon, PayPal, or any other payment processor does should not be expensive. What they do is move digital numbers from one account to another, and take a cut of it as they do so. This can be done in less than a second, at no more than the cost of the electricity required to run the computers. A few months after this, in May of 2019, Patreon decided to create a new standard. Anyone who created an account after May 6th of 2019 would end up needing to give Patreon a larger cut of their income. Older accounts would not be affected, but this is most likely to stop further trouble and further rebellion. You see, there actually is a downside of being a private company, and no, they can't just do whatever they want. Investors tend to expect expect infinite growth when it comes to these companies. And if you do something like ban someone as popular as Sargon was on very weak arguments, it affects your image, and more importantly, it affects your bottom line. It gets the investors very angry. And Patreon dealt with this controversy very poorly. Some of the worst that I've ever seen a big website deal with a controversy. After this incident, several YouTubers reported on the Sargon banning, including Tim Pool and Matt Christensen. They both ended up getting replies from Patreon. Literally, they got calls on the phone. And this was completely unsolicited. They did not ask for a phone call. Meanwhile, Patreon as a company would not respond to Sargon, the person on trial, even through email. On the phone call Tim Pool had, he brought up several examples of other people who had not been banned, despite doing exactly what Sargon did. However, the Patreon representative stated that they could not comment on other private accounts, while specifically going out of their way to talk to him about a private account. Matt Christensen's call was with a representative from Patreon's Trust and Safety Council, Jacqueline Hart. Preceding this call, she had specifically asked if he was recording before they began any proceedings, and she asked about this several times. Matt said that he wasn't recording, and technically he wasn't. Matt was transcribing the conversation, and this is why we have evidence of what was spoken during this phone call.
Each of these segments of the discussion had significant revelations, but none more significant to me than three primary ones. First, that explicitly, by Jacqueline's description, Patreon is not a free speech platform. Second, that explicitly, by Jacqueline's description, Patreon is not a free market. And third, explicitly, by Jacqueline's description, rules enforcement on Patreon is subjective by design. If you take nothing else away from this video, I want you to remember those three things.
What Jacqueline says is both telling and confusing, as well as very chilling. The transcript of the call is fascinating in the worst possible ways. Jacqueline has stated that to accomplish the mission of Patreon, they have to build a community of creators that are comfortable sharing a platform, and if they allow certain types of speech that, quote-unquote, some people would call free speech, then only creators who use Patreon that don't mind their branding being associated with that kind of speech would be those that use Patreon. I want to make a side note here. This statement is incredibly fallacious when it comes to a place as large as an internet platform like Patreon, and I'm getting annoyed that's an argument that keeps coming up, that certain people or products must be removed because their competitors do not want to share a platform with something of disrepute. This is also an argument that comes up whenever a controversial game makes it to Steam, such as the game Active Shooter. It was a game that would let you play as a school shooter. There is an argument that more reputable people would actually like a game like that as competition. If the consumer had a choice between my game, for instance, or one about playing as a school shooter, if those were the two games next to each other on a shelf, generally speaking, people would go to my game because the competitor was being so blatantly distasteful. It works the same way with people. If there are incredibly controversial people on your platform, they generally will not attract the people who are actually respectable. Respectable people will choose more respectable items and more respectable people. Items or people that are disgusting in some way, shape, or form tend to only get popularity because you turn the controversy and spotlight onto them. The forbidden fruit effect is a very real thing, and it's another reason why censorship doesn't work. Jacqueline Hart has stated that Patreon has to be especially harsh on people who use slurs against people with marginalized identities. Twitter's representative said something similar on the Joe Rogan podcast, where they specifically need to go out of their way to ban certain types of language, specifically insults based on identity. On places like Twitter, you are far more likely to get banned if you call someone by a slur than you are if you were to give out a death threat. Their logic is that these people of marginalized identities need extra protections to be able to use the platform. The issue with this kind of attitude is that it can and has been seen as sexist, racist, and of other kinds of prejudice by both the left and the right. The right calls it the bigotry of low expectations. The logic goes like this. People in the majority class are expected to be strong enough to deal with the insults based on their identity. By saying that minorities need special attention in this regard, you are saying that they are emotionally weaker than the people in the majority. People on the left call this white savior syndrome, that you think that you are better than these minorities and you need to be their defender.
Part of this portion of the conversation was also about some sort of ambiguous pressure Jacqueline says payment processors are applying to Patreon to keep them in line.
This part of Matt's video is absolutely fascinating to me. After Sargon was banned from Patreon, he went to a Patreon competitor, Subscribestar. Within a week after Sargon joined Subscribestar, PayPal dropped support of the platform, nearly killing it. For most people caught in the crossfire, it appeared very much that the buck did not stop at Patreon. The removal of Subscribestar from PayPal services happened so quickly that to many it felt like collusion. In fact, one YouTuber Law, who documents ongoing tech cases having to do with things like this, began preparing a lawsuit to get this declared as collusion. I am going to say this right now. If there is anything that scares me in making this documentary, it is talking about the sins of payment processors. The only thing that scared me more than not talking about them was, well, leaving the power that these companies have unchecked and not called out on. In short, companies like PayPal and Patreon are what inspired Technocracy as a documentary. Science fiction writers often imagined a cashless society, where people wouldn't use money. They just use a card or some other identification like a fingerprint. We are very close to such a society now, it seems. About a decade ago, it wasn't a rare sight to see a store that wouldn't take credit or debit. Nowadays, the inverse is much more common. There exist many stores that won't accept physical cash, especially in big cities. They'll only accept debit or credit. And what would you expect when more than 90% of the world's currency is digital? When you get banned from Twitter, what happens? You get cut away from the conversation and you may lose a following. However, that can still be gotten through other means, even if there is only one Twitter. What happens if you get banned from YouTube? Worst case scenario, you have lost your job. It's unfortunate, but being fired does happen in the real world. It isn't too far out of the norm, for better or for worse. What happens if you get banned from somewhere like PayPal? Many goods and services on the internet only serve through PayPal, or its only competitor, Stripe. What I say about PayPal also applies to Stripe. They are the same Stripe, if you will, and it is the very real definition of a duopoly. PayPal is the means of which I personally pay both my artists and my editors. If I got banned from YouTube, I'd be able to survive, but getting locked from my PayPal account would be damning. It is one of the only ways to transfer wealth to people that are not businesses. I mean, you could give people your credit card number and your bank information, but that would be a stupid idea, for obvious reasons. But you have to keep in mind, even though we use PayPal to transfer wealth, PayPal is just as much a private company as Twitter, and they are just as able to ban people as Twitter, or in Subscribestar's case, entire businesses. Many internet models rely on PayPal. The people who have been banned by PayPal do tend to be of the nastier sort. They banned both the Proud Boys and Antifa. One group is far right and the other group is far left. But they're not the only people that PayPal have banned, or have the ability to ban. Subscribestar was a neutral party. Before it was abandoned by PayPal, no one had heard of the platform. From an outside perspective, it looked like they just banned Subscribestar because Sargon was on it. This means that not only are they attacking the freedom of speech, but the freedom of association, which is far scarier. If these companies don't like who you are talking to, who you are associating with, they can cut you off, and that kind of power is frightening at any regard. When people with a certain political view get banned, what happens is that what becomes acceptable shrinks further than what is expected. There will always be a most offensive person on your platform. There will always be a craziest person. PayPal has banned Alex Jones, and they've gotten themselves sued in the process. Even if he was gone, that only leaves room for the next Alex Jones, the next conspiracy theorist. There will always be one. Maybe you can get rid of this kind of behavior on a platform like Twitter. That's because not everyone needs to use Twitter, but virtually everyone needs to spend money. You cannot function in a society, in adult life, without spending money. This is a need that people of the far left, the far right, and everywhere in between has to do. And do you know what happens when someone can't do something as simple as exchange wealth in a society? These people will become excluded from society. That definitely seems to be the goal of removing them from a platform like PayPal. But when people become excluded from society, they don't go away, they become more and more radical. What happens when you take away every single one of a person's options? What would you do if you were suddenly no longer able to access your bank? Your only options then and there would be to either cause trouble or starve to death. And the people who are getting banned from these platforms will almost certainly fall into the former camp. It's frightening. And that's no exaggeration, because the buck does not stop with PayPal either. Things get worse. Credit cards and banks are the next rung on this ladder. Chase Bank has been closing accounts since 2013. Starting with sex workers. They stated that they had a morality clause in their account agreement. Chase Bank canceled the mortgage refinancing process for someone who had a company that made softcore pornography films, which is not illegal in the United States. It was a legal business that they banned. Chase Bank has also banned dispensaries of medical marijuana and a woman-owned condom manufacturing company. They stated that processing sales for adult-oriented products was a quote-unquote reputational risk, even though Chase Bank was doing business with places like drugstores, which were selling very similar products. And by very similar, I mean exactly the same. And yes, in 2019, they banned online personalities such as the chairman of the Proud Boys and Martina Markota. They have not given a reason for these bannings. Maybe the bannings were justified? I don't know, and I can't tell you. It should be highly illegal to close a bank account without giving a very clear reason as to why it was closed. I don't care whose bank you're closing. Then there's the credit card companies. Visa and MasterCard have taken action to ban cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin. They have classified the industry as high risk. Keep in mind, when it comes to criticisms of big banks in the credit card industry, one of the things that you'll hear first and most often is that you need to invest in cryptocurrency. And cryptocurrency is one of the few ways to exchange wealth on the internet without going through the banks or payment processors. Whether you invest in cryptocurrency, that is your own choice. It should be your own choice. It's not my choice, and it definitely shouldn't be Visa or MasterCard's choice either. Recently, an activist group, The Sum of Us, has forced MasterCard to hold a vote that would essentially create a trust and safety council on MasterCard's service, similar to the ones that we've seen on Twitter and Patreon. It will undoubtedly catch bad people who are using the service in inhumane ways. It will catch racists, sexists, and more. It will also catch people who end up becoming unpopular. Imagine what Twitter's cancel culture could do when it has sway over credit card companies. Even if you want to stop all the prejudices in the world, this is not the way to do it. Credit cards work for a similar reason that money does. When you accept a dollar bill, you can be reasonably sure that it is a real exchange of wealth, even though, yes, it is a piece of paper that is backed by very little. You can be reasonably sure that anyone you give it to will agree on its value. And the United States government can't just say, no, your dollar bills do not work. Credit cards do not change this dynamic. Ones and zeros on a computer screen actually have less real-world value than a piece of paper, which can at least be burned for warmth. The only difference is that the credit card company can say, your dollar bills do not work, even though they probably shouldn't. If you take away a credit card or debit card's reliability for one person, you take away its reliability for everyone. The only reason that PayPal, MasterCard, or Chase Bank should be banning people from their platforms is if they are accessories to committing an actual legal crime. And even then, it's tricky, because a criminal paying for something with a debit or a credit card has just left a wealth of evidence that will get them convicted. This works the same with banks as well. Banks only work because an average person can be reasonably certain that they will have the money that they put into it. When people aren't certain about this, then banks do not work. And when what we use as currency cannot be reasonably expected to function, do you know what happens? Bad things happen. Economic turmoil is the least of concerns. Society breaks down. Even if you think that Twitter or Facebook can and should ban whoever they like because they're private companies, you have to put your foot down here with these private companies. The people that have been banned in many cases I find awful, but this is not the right punishment. Not by a long shot. If someone has committed a crime, they get to see their date in court and are given a punishment that a single arbiter, a judge, grants them after hearing the whole case with them present. They have rights involved in this. PayPal or MasterCard, private companies, do not need to do this. They can ban you and exclude you from a large part of the economy because they do not like your opinions, or for any other reasons that they don't even need to give you. And they can do this forever. Lifetime imprisonment only happens in very rare circumstance. Why is lifetime banning from some of the biggest, most important social media sites the most common kind of banning there is? When you assume that people can never, ever change, you are condemning them to just that. Never, ever changing, except becoming more awful, more radical people. These bannings sound like they should be very illegal. That leads to the very obvious question. Why hasn't the United States government intervened with the credit card companies or the banks? Well, the reason for that is that this is where the buck stops with the United States government. In 2013, the United States Department of Justice launched an initiative called Operation Choke Point. Under this operation, banks would investigate certain businesses. It was originally targeted at payday lenders, but expanded to firearm dealers and other companies believed to be at a higher risk for fraud or money laundering. The idea was to choke off the oxygen for businesses that were exploiting customers. Banks were told by the FDIC that they should consider a quote-unquote reputational risk in their banking relations if they were to do business in fields such as pornography. Does that sound familiar? Lawful industries were targeted by this initiative. Here's a source that I had to pull off internet's Wayback Machine, because it had been removed from oversight.house.gov for a reason that I do not know. Operation Choke Point was designed to choke out high-risk businesses, despite the fact that these businesses were legal. And it was a wide variety of industries, too, without much regard for what they actually were. No one standard includes all of these categories. Some of the things targeted were Ponzi schemes and racist materials, but thrown in were coin dealers and telemarketing. Dating services and travel clubs are targeted. And we are still seeing the effects of this, even though the operation was ended in 2017. And if you're wondering, this was very much illegal for the government to do. In 2010, the Supreme Court ruled that the First Amendment protected the right of corporations and unions to spend money on political speech in Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. It was a controversial ruling, but as can be extrapolated, in the United States, at least for now, spending money is a form of speech, which should be constitutionally protected. Before I started this, I had the belief that the biggest issue was the PayPal Stripe duopoly. And that is definitely a massive problem, one of the biggest problems on the internet. If you're transferring wealth on the internet, you have to go through at least one of them in most cases, unless you give out your bank details, which you absolutely should not do. or invest in cryptocurrency, which is risky, even if you know exactly what you're doing. And Visa and MasterCard have attempted to ban it. I thought that the United States government would be a solution here, as they probably should have some kind of means for any of its citizens to exchange wealth between its other citizens. But if the United States government is willing to do something as brazen as this, they're obviously not the solution either. At this point, the wisest option might be to just put your money under your mattress.